Thank you very much, Prof. Christie, for this warm introduction, and welcome to everyone, those who are with us here and those, of course, who are joining us virtually. It's a great honor and privilege to be afforded the opportunity to present this first masterclass in the TAB project, as Prof. Christie was saying. And I'm coming from another event where I was talking the BRICS event, which was taking place at the University of Zululand. And then in between, I was caught up somewhere doing other things. Obviously, then the list goes on. But then, in the interest of time, I'll cut to the chase so that we have ample time for discussions. I don't see myself as a preacher. I've never even ventured into the terrain. So I'll try to stick to what I know best, which is just making a few points, and then we'll engage. As Christy was saying, then we are looking at this particular question as to what would the decolonization of knowledge entail, and a couple of issues then we'll be talking to. I just listed a few of them here. I'm not going to spend time on that. I'll zoom straight into the introduction, where I argue that knowledge production is what all universities across the globe aspire to. There's the reason why, for instance, we have students at different universities. In this case, we have our university here, Walter Sisulu University. We have our colleagues from Brazil, Canada, and the UK. The reason is basically to generate knowledge within our spaces and then share that knowledge with others so the conversation can continue. It is for this reason that PhD students are urged to contribute to new knowledge in their thesis. If you write a PhD thesis and there is no new knowledge, then you might as well start afresh. Because the idea is that if you write a PhD thesis, you must be contributing to new knowledge, so that at least then you can expand the discussion and then, of course, make sure that you present a different perspective from what has already been covered. This goal of knowledge production is achieved through research and innovation. I've said on many occasions that a university that doesn't prioritize research is as good as dead. Because even if you are a lecturer, if you are using notes from 1992, you are a dinosaur at a university. We have to keep on refreshing your mind and then being abreast of the issues that are on the table. Otherwise, we'll be talking about East Germany, we'll be talking about USSR, things that are gone. So therefore, it's important to always keep on being innovative and then, of course, conducting research. Power dynamics are always at play when it comes to knowledge production. I once wrote a piece where I was looking at this issue in terms of international relations, looking at power dynamics in international relations thinking and writing, arguing that there are people who own that space because they have the power to do so. Some of the powers we'll talk to in a few minutes. Even in publishing, where knowledge is disseminated, there are gatekeepers who decide which knowledge is worth sharing. In other words, whether we are submitting to a journal or to somebody compiling a book or any of those platforms, there will always be gatekeepers, and then we have to find a space so that at least your voice can be heard. Not surprisingly, the call for the decolonization of knowledges has received new impetus in the global south. Power dynamics are being tested and confronted. In other words, people from the global south, where we also belong in the main, are saying that that space where knowledge is being produced and is being shared, that space is being contested because it's been dominated by certain individuals. Then we want to basically uncircle that. And that is why there is then that a struggle that is happening in terms of those spaces. Against this backdrop, today's discussion looks at what the decolonization of knowledge will entail from an African perspective by proposing some practical solutions. I'm not claiming that the solutions I'm going to propose are in fact cast in stone or they are final. No, it's just to put them on the table, then we can engage. The thrust of the argument is that decolonization of knowledges is not fixed to one item, but is broad. Like, for example, there are people who will be talking about this decolonization agenda focusing primarily on the curriculum. Others will look at other things. Others will look at the research methods. Others will look at the staff profile, student profile. So in other words, this decolonization concept is not as simple as it looks at face value. The arguments super advanced in this masterclass are not cast in stone, but are meant to contribute to the ongoing discussion about decolonization of knowledges as a global trend. In other words, this is not just a phenomenon that is confined to one continent, but it's a global phenomenon. Now, there are certain concepts that have led to this confusion. I just listed a few of them here. I argue that over the years, various concepts have been wittingly or unwittingly misused, misconstrued, and abused for various reasons. There are people who know the definitions of certain concepts, but for whatever reason, they decide to pretend as if they don't understand what they mean, and then they apply them wrongly. Among those concepts then are the following: Africanization. At one point, I asked the question, what would the Africanization of a university entail? I can share that piece through Prof. Christie, then we can engage on that at a later stage. The other one, of course, is decolonization, which is the one we're focusing on today. Another one is globalization, internationalization, localization, regionalization, and transformation. These are some of the concepts that are contested because they are approached differently at different times, and then, of course, for different reasons. So then, as I say, my focus will be on one of them today, that is decolonization. Let's start by debunking the myths about the conceptualization of decolonization by saying that in its simplest definition, decolonization means withdrawal of an oppressive regime or the process of freeing an institution from the shackles of domination. In other words, you are dominated by an outside force, and when that outside force withdraws, then of course you will argue and say you are being decolonized. This is what happened in the case of the African continent, for example. In the 1960s and 1970s, we talked about decolonization, where either France, or Portugal, or the UK, that is Britain, they were pulling out of the continent. Then we talked about decolonization, the wheels of decolonization having been activated. Once foreign dominance is removed, local content is resurrected where it didn't exist or is created where none existed. In other words, we now have a space where you can determine your fate, as it were. Because if you're under a colonial administration, colonizers will call the shots. They are the ones who decide which institutions must be there. They are the ones who decide how those institutions must run. It is in this context that Fanon once made a point that made a point that decolonization entails the creation of new people. In other words, under the colonial order, you are a particular people. Once the oppressor pulls out, then you become a new people. In other words, you do things differently, determining your fate, as I indicated earlier. Decolonization is a distinct project from other civil and human rights-based social justice projects. That is one of the points that have been made. This is so because it gives priority to local content without dismissing everything else. Here, I'm making a point that basically tries to address the issue that for you to succeed in the decolonization agenda, then you have to do away with all the other concepts I referred to, your globalization, your internationalization. It just can't happen. The only difference is that you place priority on what is local. Then you are basically then putting yourself on the agenda, and you are putting yourself number one, and then the rest will follow. Because you cannot live as an island, you are part of the whole. According to these authors, it is not a swappable term for other things. In other words, if you talk about decolonization, you cannot swap it for anything else. And it doesn't have a synonym. Decolonization is just decolonization. But there are people who use it interchangeably with Africanization. The problem is, the moment you talk about Africanization, you are then localizing it. But if you talk about decolonization, you can apply it in any part of the world, wherever there is an oppressor. When that oppressor pulls out, then you are in the process of decolonizing. Whereas Africanization is specific to the African continent, that when your erstwhile oppressors left, then you started doing things your own way, in other words, regaining ground, as it were. Oliver argues that if used recklessly, decolonization runs the risk of polarizing people all over again. And this happens, for instance, when you are trying to decolonize, and in the process of decolonizing, you are speaking to different audiences. Here, I made an example of, or some examples of the DA before the election, the Democratic Alliance, when it went to the US trying to decide what the fate of this country would be, which was, in my view, unwarranted, but they did it anyway. And then we thought we were out of the woods after the elections. And then guess what? AfriForum and Solidarity went to the US recently, and they proudly deliberated on these issues. They went to the Trump administration to discuss about issues of national importance. The question is, where is political sovereignty? Where does power reside? Where is DECO? Where is the president's office? All those kinds of issues. But we can talk about that at a later stage. The point I'm making is, in the process of decolonizing, you must be aware of the different constituencies that you represent. In the South African context, you can be talking about race, you can be talking about class, you can be talking about religious affiliation and all of that. So we're talking to different audiences. In the process of decolonizing, you will wittingly or unwittingly find yourself polarizing the nation once again without you realizing that you are doing that. But decolonization does not mean total rejection of other concepts. Instead, it stresses the prioritization of the local, in this case, African worldview and content. In other words, the point I was making earlier on, that for decolonization to exist, it doesn't mean that all other concepts must fall away. It doesn't mean that. It is a fallacy to think that for decolonization to work, there should be no globalization or internationalization. These concepts can coexist if we get the order right, e.g., giving preference to local knowledges, because Africa as a continent has generated knowledges. You'll be happy to know that the university system, in fact, started in Africa. You talk about Timbuktu in West Africa, you talk about Fez in Morocco, you talk about Sudan. That is where institutions started, even before European institutions came into the picture. Even science and technology, maths, architecture, they were here in Africa. At one point, we were told that Egypt does not belong to Africa, simply because the Nubians were more creative. And then some of our Western counterparts, they couldn't understand how come an African could do these kinds of things. Look at the pyramids, look at a lot of other things. And they say, this country, it does not exist in Africa. But then the map, in fact, disagreed with them. Then eventually I said, you know what? Those who are creative are those who are light in skin. The black ones cannot afford to do this. So these debates have been ongoing. So then when we talk about decolonization, then we must know that we'll ruffle feathers in the process, because it's not an easy process. Decolonization of knowledge is different points of emphasis. In other words, there are people who have approached the subject, but from different points of emphasis. Mngomezulu's title, Decolonizing Knowledge for Africa's Renewal, implies that Africa's renewal agenda is contingent upon decolonizing knowledges first. In other words, it's arguing that if you want to talk about decolonization, the first thing that you need to do is to make sure that, if you want to renew Africa, the first thing that you need to do is to decolonize knowledge. So the knowledge that is there is not the knowledge that will assist you in propagating the African agenda. And her letter then talks about the decolonization of higher education. So Mngomezulu is focusing on decolonization of knowledge. Then her letter is talking about decolonization of higher education as part of the decolonization of knowledges. And then Debunking focuses on decolonization of the university, not just higher education as an umbrella term, but specifically universities. So that is where, for him, you should start. Then Ngugiwa, others saying Ngugiwa Tiongo, others saying Ngugiwa Tiongo. One of our African writers, which most of you might know about. And Murphy, they unpack this concept by focusing on decolonizing the mind. So in their view, this decolonization process cannot happen until you decolonize the mind. In other words, everything revolves around how you think, and then everything will fall into place. Lehrange calls decolonizing the university curriculum. So within the university sphere, some will just take one part and say, let's talk about decolonizing the curriculum. What would that entail? And then they focus on that. Whereas, in fact, others would look at decolonizing indigenous educational policies. They look at the educational policies and argue, how do we then put the African flavor in those particular policies? Decolonization of higher education in the South African context has been on the agenda for some time. A lot of people have commented about this, but there are divergent views on the form it should take. In other words, we all agree there should be decolonization, but then we differ as to the form it should take and also the priorities that we put first. As Mbembe argues, that Achille Mbembe, and of course, Zeleza, they argue that decolonization of knowledge is a broader African project, not confined to any country or region. That is absolutely correct, because you cannot just talk about decolonization in the South African context. It must be broader than that. That is why the decolonization call reverberates across the African continent. I'm saying across the African continent because the title of my presentation is deliberate. I'm looking at this from an African perspective. It doesn't mean that other continents cannot do the same. In East Africa, for example, the political and academic leadership made a similar call of decolonization and Africanization in the context of the Federal University of East Africa. This university was meant to serve Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania after Tanganyika and Zanzibar had merged in 1964. So then they said, we are inheriting this federal university, but it's too Western. You look at the staff profile, it's Western. You look at the curriculum, it's Western. Research methods, they counted a lot of things, and then they said, no, we can't take it in its current form. Therefore, we must Africanize and decolonize it. And then there were debates as to how they're going to cooperate. You go to the archives of the East Africa Legislative Assembly, where they were arguing, others saying, no, if you Africanize and decolonize, we are going to weaken this university. Because they were under the impression that everything Western is good, everything African is bad. Then there were hot debates that happened in that sphere. Then we can talk about that after my presentation. They called for the decolonization and Africanization of the curriculum, the university staff, the research, and teaching methods, saying even the teaching methods are not working. I remember one of the leaders of Uganda, Milton Obote, saying that I almost failed my matric. That is your grade 12. I almost failed my matric because they were talking about daffodils. I didn't know what that was. And then he was arguing that had they used examples from Africa, he would have understood what the question wanted from him. But because they were using a Western curriculum, then he almost failed his exam. He passed, but he barely made it. Otherwise, he would have done much better in his view. And then clearly looks up to African intellectuals to play their role in the decolonization of knowledge. So she argues that for you to achieve this goal of decolonization, African intellectuals might come to the fore. But of course, these African intellectuals are not a homogeneous group. They also debate among themselves as to how this should happen. Now, let's look, I'm almost coming to an end. Let's look at practical steps towards the decolonization of knowledge's agenda then. How can we do that? One, we must have, having considered all of this, then we then look at some of the specifics. One, Africans and African scholars must embrace African knowledge systems, including Ubuntu, Afrocentricity, African jurisprudence, governance systems, health systems, agriculture, science, environment, etc. In other words, for this decolonization agenda to happen, we are not only relying on Africans, but we're also relying on Africanist scholars. That means people who are not necessarily of African origin, but they are writing and researching about Africa. They can also assist in this agenda by embracing African knowledge systems. I once caused an upset in one of the institutions where I was, Prof. Christie, where I said to my master's student, consider writing your thesis using Ubuntu. And instead of writing about your liberalism, realism, Marxism, all of that, just use Ubuntu. And when it went to the high degrees committee, people frowned. They said, no, but this has never happened. I said, we are doing it exactly for that reason, that it has never happened. Guess what? The student got a cum laude in her master's. Because I said, there is no way that decolonization will happen automatically. We have to start from somewhere. Our teaching methods, our research methods, the way we write our dissertations, and so on and so forth. So those are some of the things that we can do. Secondly, history books about Africa and her inventions must be reviewed to correct Eurocentric views which are factually flawed. And then I said, yes, see narratives about pyramids in Zimbabwe, pyramids that is in Egypt and Mali, and then of course the Zimbabwean ruins. Those of you who might have gone to Zimbabwe at some point, you know there is an area where we are told this is one of the oldest kingdoms, but the way that structure was built is so intact such that to this day it still exists. Then when people were investigating what could have happened, who built this, then they credited to the Portuguese. They said, no, there is no way that Africans would have built these buildings to survive this long. So they must have been built by Portuguese. Until, of course, a cover research showed that by the time the Portuguese arrived, these buildings were already in place. And therefore, Africans were vindicated to have been the ones who built those structures. And then thirdly, Africa-friendly publishing houses must be established where knowledges could be recorded. Remember, I said earlier on that at times you find that there are gatekeepers in the publishing sector. Where you want to publish something, then you are told you can publish it on condition that you take this route and not that route. So then we need then Africa-friendly publishing houses. It doesn't mean that they can only publish African material, but they must be amenable to the ideas that are coming forth, and then they must accept as long as such research is scientifically driven. Thirdly, orality must be placed at the center of African knowledge systems. For quite some time, we're told that African knowledges cannot be shared because they are only oral. That is not the point. In fact, orality is one of the research methods that we use. Those who are in the humanities will know better that, in fact, this is one of the research methods that are used. Then the fifth one, to avoid African exceptionalism, comparative studies could be carried out, including the Aztecs in America, the Aborigines in Australia, and then, of course, in the South African context, the Khoisan people. These are the people from whom we can get knowledges that will indicate to us what used to happen before we adopted Western knowledges. That is basically what I'm proposing. So the article I once wrote in 2018, what would the decolonization of a political science curriculum entail? Before coming here, I was just checking a number of people who have read it, over 2,000 of them, and they've generated interest because I was saying, let's take one subject from humanities, political science. If you wanted to decolonize this particular subject, what would you do? Then we made some suggestions. I'm not claiming those suggestions are final, but at least it's a start so that you can engage. In conclusion, firstly, what is clear from this discussion is that decolonization of knowledges is not an event, but a process which must be cogently thought through. In other words, you cannot just say, we are going to decolonize as if we are going to do an event and then we're done. It's going to be an ongoing process. Secondly, for this aim to come to fruition, it needs concerted effort by various role players. No single individual can decolonize or can help us achieve the decolonization agenda. Thirdly, the priority areas where decolonization of knowledges should happen are not the same for everyone, although they are all relevant. Like we were looking at these different views, some saying higher education, others saying decolonization of knowledge, and so on and so forth. So let us not be fixated in one item and say, for decolonization to happen, only the curriculum must be looked at. It's a wide range of issues. Fourthly, as the leader of society, the university must be at the vanguard of the decolonization of knowledge's effort. Intellectuals should come on board. I always say that I get worried when somebody is referred to as a university professor but has nothing to prophesy on. You cannot be a professor and you don't research. What are you prophesying on? It means that when you go to a PhD, you wrote your thesis, maybe convert it into a book, and then you put a full stop, a big full stop for that matter. And then you're a professor for the rest of your life. It doesn't happen like that. You have to be constantly capacitating yourself. And then, of course, you can only do that through research. And then intellectuals must come on board. But for them to do that, they must be ready for the challenges ahead. Fifthly, while today's focus is on Africa, the decolonization of knowledges project is not confined to this continent. We must all pull together. And that is why we have our colleagues from Brazil, Canada, and the UK. They are also looking at this issue from their lens, and then they can share that knowledge with us. Sixthly, decolonization of knowledges does not mean dismissing all knowledges from elsewhere. It is about the prioritization of local content. If our colleagues from the UK say that we want to prioritize our content, but then still borrow from Africa, borrow from Brazil, borrow from Canada, so be it, because it means that they are open to other ideas as well. With those few words, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to stay seated here. I'm taking it that everybody can hear me, hopefully. Just indicate, I'm sure Guilherme will indicate if I'm not audible. So questions comments? I think let me start with our live audience here in South Africa. I'm sure there are some ideas that you would like to place on the table here. Yes, please. Tell us who you are and which department you are in.
Hello, I'm Victoria Aluko. I'm doing law. My question is, what are practical steps that we as university students can take to decolonize?
Thank you for that. Another question? Please.
No, thank you very much. My name is Mngomezulu Vena, and I'm from the science faculty. I agree with you, Prof, when you say that it has been taken as law that knowledge, is mostly Eurocentric or Western, in order for it to, to be taken as a fundamental, truth, So mine is that, Prof, I like that you have, alluded to methodologies like, Afrocentric, scholarly, research methods, and also the rupturing of the current, structural, systemic, epistemological, coloniality, for lack of a better word, I don't know. So mine is that how do we, and they are solid, by the way, those points that you have alluded to. But mine is that how do we stop this institution from being swallowed into the same old system? All right, that's number one. So, as we've seen from
Sorry, our institution, you mean this one?
this one,
Okay.
yes, NMU. So, as we've seen from the past decolonial initiatives that tried to decolonize, they were swallowed. So what revolutionary mechanisms, to build on the first question, what revolutionary mechanisms can students and staff use to keep the academy accountable, so that this is just a reform, but which elites can hijack, but it's also sustained and an anti-capitalist break. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Another question from you? Over there, thanks.
No, thanks, Chair. My name is Sibusiso Twala. I'm from student housing. Very odd, people are calling faculties, but in my previous life, I was an educator, and I'm still contemplating pursuing a PhD. And hence why from time to time I come to these gatherings just to engage myself in the discourse and all of that. I think first and foremost, it would be important that we welcome the input from Prof. Yeah, that was a lot. It's interesting that as this takes place, engagement, there's an unfortunate incident that happened over the weekend. As we all know, in Mandela, a student was knocked over by a taxi and all of that. And I'm raising this in light of the topic of the day around these knowledge systems that I think it was last year and a year before that, where some of the student organizations decided to slaughter a cow there in those grounds at the South Campus. And there was a particular interpretation from an African point of view, ba yinkundla le abenzela kuyo lando ukuba kuphalale igazi ngolaa hlobo. And there was a view that perhaps there ought to be something done about that. And do all of that. And it's interesting that post that, there's been many incidences that have happened in the institution. But when calls for that to be made, you are told of policy and that this is a university and so forth. For me, it's very interesting because it captures the essence of the very topic about decoloniality and knowledge systems and the role, therefore, that the university plays, especially a university like ours that says in Vision 20 it wants to be an African university. I would like a comment from you on that. The second one, I was noting the definition of how you put it, decoloniality, classically as a withdrawal of an oppressing power and all of that. In the context of South Africa, how do you engage that, Prof? 1955, of course, with the adoption of the Freedom Charter, and I think the main issue was the acceptance that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white and all of that. Now, within this very diverse society of ours, with a multitude of values and so forth, the question therefore arises, can we then truly achieve the goal of decoloniality in this context, and what could then be some of the barriers to that? A comment perhaps, because it's again dealing with the knowledge, decoloniality of the, or decolonizing knowledge and all of that. It was interesting during COVID, because I know that the medicine sector and all of that is a big debate around there, where your African ways of healing and all of that are looked down upon. But during COVID, it was very interesting that everyone else was looking for these solutions from an African perspective. Kusetyenziswa imihlonyane, uzifo zonke, amaboza, and all of this stuff. It was very interesting. So, but again, as you say, you can't therefore run away from the context. And the context is also insofar as the economic outlook. Every sector of the South African economy continues to reflect the patterns that it did before your so-called democratic breakthrough. If you look at the pharmaceutical sector, if you look at your big banks, you look at construction and everything else, it continues to then reflect that. Can we therefore truly decolonize with those in place? What are the barriers and what ought to be done could be a question to you. And maybe as I sit, the one on language becomes interesting again. Ngungiga Tiogo, as you mentioned, where he argues, of course, that language plays a dual factor in that it's both a means of communication, but it is also a carrier of heritage and culture. If you look at the performance of South African students, as I said, I've got an education background. I'll speak a bit on that. I spoke about it in my master's thesis. We are being outperformed by other countries within the African continent who have got a lower GDP than ours. Different studies, whether you look at the PELS, the Progress in International Reading and Literacy Study, when you look at the TIMS, Trends in International Maths and Science Studies, SACMAC and other studies, consistently tell us that our learners cannot read for meaning. They struggle enormously with arithmetic and so forth. So there's a crisis there. But if you dig deeper, and I think there is some research that is done that says if you actually, particularly early childhood development, you are taught in your mother tongue, your ability to be able to grasp knowledge and so forth and even excel in other language becomes higher. So have we done enough, particularly on the issue of language? You see, even now, I mean, we have these engagements and all of that, but the fact that even in our ability to express ourselves and communicate, we're not doing in that is very interesting. And then the last one, of course, I think I agree with you, publishing and historical
if you can wrap
documents.
up, please.
I liked it. There's the book now that was released by Dr. J.J. Klass, The Triangle of 100 Years War, in trying to change the narrative of what actually would have happened. So that's an interesting. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for that. I know there are a number of questions here, and also, Jenny, I did notice you. I'm going to, before Bheki gets overwhelmed, I'm going to ask you to address this first round of questions, and then we'll take the second round. Is that good?
Okay, thanks. No, thank you very much, colleagues, for these very thought-provoking questions, but relevant ones nonetheless. Yeah, on the first question, Aduko, you are asking a very pertinent question, particularly because we are an institution of higher education, and for an institution to exist, there must be students. I've said this point in another institution where I was roped into management, and then my dean at the time said, Bheki, you are part of management, but you are always speaking on behalf of students. I said, yes, you got it right, Prof. For me, students take first priority because there is no university without students. And then it became a story, a long story. But your question is relevant because we are looking at the role that students can play in this decolonization agenda or decolonization project. It doesn't mean that you have to perform miracles. It starts with very small things. Let's say, for instance, you are given an assignment to write in any subject for that matter. Because even if you're in science, in the science field, you can always look at your IKS, that is your indigenous knowledge systems. You can always do that. When I was in the States, I was studying with someone who was doing the history of science. He was a pure scientist, but he was in the history faculty doing the history of science. So it's doable. But practically, one of the things that you could do, for instance, is by writing your local histories, as it were, or your local politics. We normally like grand politics. I become known because I know the history of America, the history of Russia, the history. It's fine. But then do you know your own history? It starts from there. So that when you are given an assignment, then the examples that you use should be examples that come from your local context because you know them better. That is one way you can do it. Then you have student structures. In this case, I'll talk about student leadership structures like your SRC or any of those structures. There are certain things that we do in those structures that don't define who we are. But we've embraced that as a culture. That is how things are done, therefore we'll do it this way. Can we just do things differently? I'm impressed by this slaughtering of a cow, for instance, because the students are saying that where we grew up, whenever you have an event, we have to slaughter an animal. Either you slaughter a cow, you slaughter a chicken, you slaughter a goat, a sheep, whatever it is. You are doing it in a particular context. Some do it in a religious context. Do you know your African religious systems, which will inform what you do? And then if you were to do it in a university context, what are the policies of the university? I always have an issue when somebody tells me we cannot do this because this is what the policy says. I ask the question, do you know the policy cycle? Because the policy cycle starts with the policy need, policy formulation, policy adoption, policy implementation, and policy review. If you want to define yourself as an African university, but then your hands are tied because the policy does not allow it, then initiate a process to revise the policy. There is nothing stopping you from doing that. That is why at CANRAD last year, we organized a dialogue where we're looking at the possibility of reviewing our constitution. Because whenever we can't do certain things, no, the constitution doesn't allow. Who wrote the constitution? Is it not us? If the constitution is not taking us to where we want to go, why shouldn't we review it? So the point I'm making is, as a student, there is little that you can do, but that is not same as saying there is nothing that you can do. Because the questions in the main are set by your lecturers, but you can play the game using the rules of your of your lecturer, and then try to bring in your African flavor where possible, which includes, of course, these theories. Maybe some lecturers will prescribe for you which theory you must use for this research project. Then propose an alternative theory and talk about Afrocentricity, for instance, and say, okay, I know all these other theories, but then let's try this one and see how it will work practically. So there are certain things we can do, but of course I do take the point that you might not be having all the powers, but the little that you can do will make an impact. I like it also when our science students are engaging on what would traditionally fall under humanities discussions, because then it means that we are embracing this idea that we can no longer be fixated in one academic field. We must look at interdisciplinarity and then make sure that we all read from the same script. So in other words, how do we then address issues at our institutional level? The first thing will be to identify those practices that we are not happy with, right? You identify them, you list them, and then you identify who is owning policy X, who is owning policy B. Without being confrontational, you then mobilize yourself into a group, you formulate a submission, then you take it through the right channels. It's not going to take a minute. It's going to take time. That's why I said decolonization is not an event, but a process. But you have to start from somewhere. You know what is not right. You know what you want to decolonize, then engage in the process to decolonize that. I'll make one example with the curriculum. You are being taught a curriculum that is decided by your lecturers, isn't it? I'm not saying people must be revolutionary, no. All I'm saying is you look at this curriculum, you look at the research methods, you look at everything else, it doesn't make sense to you, but you have to comply because you are a student. It doesn't mean that. It means that you have to find ways to reason with your lecturer. If you have class reps, you start there, you reason with them, and then you negotiate your way up until you find a solution. That's why I insisted that it's a process, not an event. So it's doable, it might take long, but we'll get there eventually. So that then our institutions are not swallowed by conventional practice. Yeah, sometimes we are told that, no, this is not conventional practice, so therefore you cannot do it. No, that argument does not go. Does not hold, because then it means we've been doing this thing for so long, to the extent that I normally use the phrase, you normalize an abnormal situation. It's like someone who's been lying consistently. You will think that the lie is in fact the absolute truth when it's a lie. The only reason is that it has been told several times. So then we have to start from somewhere. Then, Mr. Twala, you said a mouthful. It's a couple of issues, but then I'll just summarize them. The examples you used about that incident and then where our students perished, others got injured. Yeah, it was a painful experience indeed. But then let's ask a basic question. This fresher party, what are your views about that? Does it assist you in the decolonization agenda, or we're doing it because all other universities are doing it? What are we hoping to achieve? Those are some of the critical but tough questions that we need to ask. And then after having answered those questions or addressed those questions, how do we do it the way we want it to be done? Not the way it has been done, but the way we want it to be done. Like, this is a sad tragedy. What have we learned from this? Are we going to do the same thing next year and risk losing other students' lives? I don't think so. So it means that the student leadership at this institution, and all other institutions for that matter, have to look at what has happened up to now, what is right about it, what is wrong about it, what is an alternative, and then engage in a process to try and do things differently. As I say, it also means that everyone has to come on board. Then your point about withdrawal and the South African context is very interesting. We normally talk about South African exceptionalism because we say there was a pre-colonial era, colonial era, and post-colonial era. This applies across many continents where there were colonizers. But in the South African context, it's slightly different because you had colonizers. The British came in 1795 up to 1803, and then they came back 1806 until 1910. Then I've argued elsewhere that, in fact, our democracy was supposed to have kicked in 1910. Yes, democracy was given, or freedom was given, but it went to the wrong people. because it went to people of Dutch descent, and then those are the ones then who started now running this country from 1910, of course, mixed with some whites here and there, some English-speaking whites here and there, until then, of course, Herzog came up with a segregation policy. Then D.F. Malan won in 1948 and said, okay, what has been called the segregation policies, we are formalizing it now. It becomes government policy, then he called it apartheid, which is what we had from 1994 up until, of course, 1948 until 1994. So your point about this South African exceptionalism is correct in a way, but then I would also argue that it's similar to what happened elsewhere, in the sense that if you look at those to whom freedom was given in 1910, they will argue that they were also oppressed. If you look up at the Great Track, the reason why they ran away from the Cape is because they were running away from Milner's Anglicization policy. They would argue that they were also oppressed. So they got their freedom in 1910, and then we had to wait for a couple of years until you, as a general South African public, then got yours in 1994. Whether it's freedom or what, I am not sure at the moment. We can talk about that. But the reality is that as much as there are differences in the South African context, but there are things that are also similar. Then lastly, your point about a language. Yes, language can be a tool of communication, but it can also be used to preserve culture and heritage. That is why some of us, when we write, we sometimes use poems to write political science papers and write history papers. At some point, in fact, I wrote a detailed paper looking at Chinua Achebe's novels. And I was saying that in those novels, they were written for literary scholars, but then as political scientists and as historians, you could extract certain things that resonate with your academic field. And I was also looking at this issue of transdisciplinarity, and it worked very well. And I was presenting it in an English seminar, where most of the students were there were English students and English lecturers. And I was coming as a historian / political scientist. And then I did a fantastic job in my view, because people were happy about what I did there. So the point I'm making here then is in terms of language, we have a problem because more especially here in South Africa, if we were to come and say, let us do what the Chinese are doing, the Japanese are doing, the Russians are doing, everybody else is doing, where you come in on a scholarship and they say, for the first 6 months, you must learn the local language. There you come in South Africa. How many official languages do we have? 12 languages. Then the question will be, which official language are we going to prefer? Then a proposal will be, it depends on where the university is geographically located. Here in the Eastern Cape, the common language is isiXhosa. So then arguably then would say the language here should be isiXhosa, even the medium of instruction should be isiXhosa. Then others will say, no, this is discriminating. We also speak Afrikaans, want Afrikaans to be included, and then the list goes on. So we have a problem in South Africa. It's easier in other countries because they will have their national language, and then they will have a foreign language, then it's fine. But with us, it's gonna be difficult. We'll try. The only possibility I can see is to look at where the university is located. Then in the case of KwaZulu-Natal, then isiZulu becomes the obvious option. But then what happens in Gauteng, where you have Sesotho and Setswana? Of course, they're closely related, but they say, no, one Setswana, not isiXhosa. Then you go to Limpopo, it's easy. You take Shivenda, and then you are sorted. So it's doable, but it's not going to be easy. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Bheki. I have a few questions. Let me now turn to our online audience, and then I'll come back to our audience here. Gulam, do you want to ask your question directly?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
It's loud and clear.
Okay, great. Thank you, first of all, Professor Bheki, for your great presentation. And you mentioned the concept of Ubuntu. Could you talk more about this concept for those who are not familiar with it and how it can contribute to the decolonization of knowledge?
Okay.
And then we have a question from Patience. Patience, do you want to ask your question yourself, or would you prefer us to read it?
Hi. I think I would prefer to be read. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for your question. And Patience is saying, hello, Professor Bheki and everyone. I was particularly fascinated by your point about how decolonization transforms formerly colonized people into a new people. This is the reference to Fanon's writing. And she says, in our attempts to decolonize knowledge, are we striving for the permanent replacement of Western systems? Or, given the changes brought about by colonization, are we instead seeking to merge Africanized knowledge systems with established Eurocentric ones to create a symbiotic coexistence? That's a beefy one for you, Bheki. And we've got a question here from Igor. Igor, I'm just going to read it. Igor is a student at the Environmental Science Postgraduate Program at the University of Sao Paulo. He says, I would like to ask how this decolonial perspective can contribute to environmental research and to overcoming the socio-environmental crisis we are facing. And I think let's then take two questions from here, starting with Jenny.
Thank you. This is something I've just been thinking about lately in the various discussions I've been in around decolonization and Africanization. There was a webinar series last year held by Anti-Racism Lab that was about decolonization in context, and a lot of discussion around Africanization, decolonization, again, like Bheki, you've been discussing. And so what's kind of emerging is how important is both that how decolonization is both a global issue, but how it takes on the particular concerns in the way in which it might be played out or what needs to be focused on are going to it's going to very much depend on the context. And you kind of have the sense sometimes in the literature that we're still kind of dominated largely by thinking around decolonization that comes from the States or Canada or maybe South America. So there's kind of is a bit of a dominance there, and we don't necessarily take into account other contexts. With that in mind, though, I sometimes wonder whether when we talk about Africanization, we tend to end up talking about indigeneity and localization. And I was just wondering whether, as important as that is, if there is a way in which sometimes we end up reinscribing a very colonial binary logic, which thinks of Western knowledges as somehow transcendent and universal, and African knowledges as those things that have been forgotten or need to be retrieved from the past or are local or specific. And so I was just wondering, when we think about these terms, if sometimes maybe we need to try and broaden our conceptualizations of those terms. So thinking about what an Africanization project looks like if you think beyond the continent, for example, and also just in thinking about those ways in which movement across different places has always been taking place. So like migration on the continent and exchange of knowledges has always been a thing. So I'm just wondering about your thoughts on that and how we think about these things differently, and maybe that could help us get out of some of these cul-de-sacs that we sometimes end up when we're trying to think through how to approach these issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Over there.
My name is Mngomezulu. Firstly, Prof, I would like to thank you for this informative presentation. By the way, I'm doing my first year in studying in the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences. My question to you is, do you think that decolonization of knowledge and making African indigenous knowledge our primary knowledge would help us to perhaps stay relevant in this industrialized world, considering that it is the fourth industrial revolution, I think, that exists mostly because of the Western knowledge, and of course, the economic aspect and corporate aspect of it. Will we be able to stay competitive as a continent as a whole on the corporate side, considering that the corporate side involves people of like diverse people? So do you think Africa as a whole will be able to be competitive if we would make African indigenous knowledge our primary knowledge? Yeah, thank you.
Right, thank you. Another, yes, over there.
Okay, thanks, Prof, for that heavyweight lecture. So my question, I've written it down. So in the process of decolonization, do we then have to restructure and redo even the buildings of coloniality, in particular the structures of our institutions? For an example, in Africa, a long time ago, when we were taught something, we used to sit in circles, and that apparently it had impacts on those who are being taught to receive and understand that information if they are seated in a circle. So do we then have to also make our classrooms to be built in a state where we will be able to sit in circles so that we can understand better? And also, just to add, the buildings in general, like the ones here in Port Elizabeth, now known as Igqubeka, they are a spitting image of European buildings. Do we then, when you say we are decolonizing, do we then have to restructure even those buildings? Yeah, I hope I'm clear. That's my question. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to sneak in another one online from our audience. Vinicius Dovale. He's saying, yeah, hello, Professor Bheki, thank you for your presentation. You mentioned the risk of polarization, and I would like you to explore this point further, as I believe it is a very important issue. The issue is that the topic of decolonization runs the risk of being framed and perceived within a polarized context. With this in mind, how can we develop decolonization strategies that avoid this risk? In other words, could you elaborate on this risk of polarization and the challenges it poses to the advancement of decolonization? Bheki, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, this is a lot. Yeah, but it's worth it. That is basically the idea behind this these sessions, which Prof. Christie is organizing, and they are quite informative. As I indicated earlier on, I don't see myself as a pastor. I see myself as part of the whole. In other words, I learn from you as much as you learn from me so that we can engage. Let's start with Ubuntu. Ubuntu is not necessarily an isiXhosa word or isiZulu word or whatever. It's normally used in the wider African context, mainly amongst the Nguni languages. That is isiXhosa, isiZulu, isiNdebele, isiSwati, and of course, Kiswahili. And if those who come from East Africa will know that Kiswahili, has a number of similarities with these languages. Some, at some point, they called them Bantu languages. Others said that concept was more political, and then they came with something else. Because in Kiswahili, if you talk about inyama, that is meat. Umama, that's it. So there are quite a number of terms. I got to know this during my short stay in Kenya, and then I was trying to speak a little bit of Kiswahili so that I could move around easily. The problem was when I went outside the capital city, Nairobi. You go to the east, they speak Kikamba, and it is not Swahili. Go to the west, they speak Jaluo. Then we're in trouble. Go to the south, the Maasai, they speak a different language. But generally, Kiswahili is accessible. So the issue of Ubuntu basically means that you are because I am. There's a simple version. You are because I am. And I was arguing the point that even in international relations, you can use this concept to understand why countries are fighting and then try to suggest how they could stop these fights. If, for example, I am President Vladimir Putin, and I decide I want to attack President Zelensky in Ukraine, it's fine. There are things I want to achieve, there are goals I want to achieve, but let me ask the question, what would the impact of that be to the innocent people? Is it in line with Ubuntu? And then you look at, for example, this movement from a bipolar world controlled by Russia and America to the unipolar world controlled by America, and then now a move towards a multipolar world. How then does Ubuntu assist us in that regard? In other words, it doesn't matter whether I have military power or economic power. With Ubuntu, I will still be reading things from the other side. I cannot impose things on you just because I happen to have money or because I happen to be militarily strong. So Ubuntu, therefore, as a concept, is meant to acknowledge the fact that you are a human being, you have a right to exist, but similarly, the other person has a right to exist. So Ubuntu, therefore, it is usually defined as a philosophy, an African philosophy, which is meant to ensure that people live in harmony. So before you do something to somebody else, you put yourself in that person's shoes. How would you feel if the same thing were to happen to you? Then in that way, you are able to move along in a better way than you would be doing. So Ubuntu, therefore, generally, I would say it's about that. But it can be used beyond the African continent, can be used everywhere to try and understand and unpack certain things. Patience is asking a question about us promoting decolonization and whether that would mean displacing everything else. I tried to explain earlier on that decolonization, for it to exist, doesn't mean that everything must disappear. In other words, there should be a symbiotic relationship between decolonization and everything else, internationalization, globalization, and all the rest. In other words, the argument here is not we are replacing the old with the new, because then it would mean in the South African context, we are bringing apartheid in its reverse form. Let's say, for example, our Afrikaners at some point oppressed the black masses. Then the black masses were on the seat now in 1994. Then they would say, let's return the favor. Then the country will be in ashes and it wouldn't assist us. In other words, it will be colonization of a special type or apartheid in its reverse form, and it wouldn't achieve anything. So in other words, there should be a symbiotic relationship, which then goes together with the point about the rendezvous, whereby you are asking a question as to whether we should replace these buildings and then make sure that we come up with buildings that were used in the African context. The answer is no. All you do is you make sure that these buildings coexist. Let's say, for example, take Nelson Mandela University. We have 6 campuses, isn't it? 5 in Kabech and then 1 in George. Then why don't you start from somewhere and then have a building built in the form of a rendezvous? You are not going to change the buildings that are there, because if you were to destroy these buildings, it basically will be insane. We don't have money to start with as a country, let alone as an institution. As a country, you don't have money. And then if you were to destroy these buildings, then you'll be shooting yourself in the foot. But what you do is, you then, parallel to the buildings that are already in existence, you then come up with other buildings to say, this university is in Africa, let's give it an African flavor, even though we still embrace the other part. Because in my study of the history of higher education in Africa, and of course across the globe, I've come to the realization that a university has many identities. The university is a local context. You must respond to the local needs. It also has a regional context, a continental context, and then, of course, an international context. In other words, the university is all of that at once. That is why you have students coming from outside your country coming to an institution. You have students coming from other provinces coming to an institution. We have the lecturing staff also coming from, in other words, the university cannot be defined only in a local context. It has all these identities. Similarly, in terms of this infrastructure, therefore, architecture, then it has to change. By the way, this is the same argument that happened with the Federal University of East Africa. Some were making the arguments that, look at these buildings. They are all Western. Let's come up with buildings that are going to define this federal university in all its locations in the 3 countries, that is Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Let's make sure these buildings reflect that this is an African university. The counter argument was, what are you going to do with the buildings that are already in existence? Where are you going to get money to change the entire architecture of the university? Then they came to the conclusion that some of these goals are not achievable. It's easy to talk, but when it comes to putting those talks into action, then it's a different ball game altogether. So in other words, the point then is we are looking for a symbiotic relationship and of course coexistence of the African flavor and then everything else. Then that is the only way you can achieve that. Then the question from my brother on environmental research. In other words, how would decolonization assist in that? There is a book which is called Greenland, Brownland, and Blackland. And there is another one written by Israel Kimambo, who is from Uganda, where it talks about environmental issues. And then it says that Africans had a way of interacting with the environment. Forget about what we've been told, that Africans destroy environment and then Westerners come and rescue it. That's a lie. The reality is that when Africans were burning fells, they would do that strategically. They would know that from here to here, we are going to burn this part and leave this one. Once there is fresh grass, we are going to move our stock from this side to this side and then burn the other one. And the reason why they did that, one was to make sure that you don't have forests everywhere. But then secondly, they wanted to deal with tsetse flies, where there were tsetse flies, and all other kinds of things that were happening. So in other words, they knew when to burn and how to burn. In other words, if you bring in the African flavor to how things are done, then of course, you are most likely to contribute to environmental studies and environmental research. Not to say that we are going to replace everything else with the African way of doing things, but we can infuse what used to happen with the current one and then we move on. Because even culture is not static, it changes over time. And then of course you borrow from this culture, then you become a better person if you bring the two together. Okay, and then Jenny's question, these concepts, Africanization, indigenization, localization, internationalization, globalization, I deliberately started with those concepts because some people use them interchangeably and they get lost in the process and they pretend as if they are not aware that they are lost. The reality is that if, for example, we were to talk about Africanization, then we'd be talking about differently from decolonization, in the sense that Africanization is specific to the African continent and Africans in the diaspora. There will be Africans, which brings in the point Jenny was making about migration. There are Africans who are born in Africa but who reside elsewhere. They can still practice Africanization where they are, provided, of course, that they obey the laws of those countries. So there are ways that you can try to bring the African flavor wherever you are. But when it comes to indigenization and decolonization, these concepts can be used everywhere. In other words, you are sitting in Brazil, you can talk about indigeneity. You are sitting in Canada, sitting in the UK, you are sitting in Russia, you can talk about indigeneity. Some of you recall that last year when the leader of the UK, the current leader, the king of the UK, visited Australia for the very first time, he met something he didn't anticipate, where he was told by the Aborigines, the people who are the Aborigines in Australia. They said, no, you don't have a place here. This is our country, it's not your country. You cannot come here and dictate to us. Yeah, it was an embarrassment because we have someone coming from the UK, coming here for the first time. The king is coming here, and we expect everyone to allow the king to walk freely on this red carpet. They go, no. You don't own this place. This is our place. But then, obviously, we cannot then argue and say all whites who are now in Australia, including South Africans, by the way, who are there. I was there last year, and I met a couple of them. Some are willing to come back, but they say we're just watching the space. And then others have said, no, we're not going back there. So the reality, therefore, is that even if you're in Australia or you're in America with the Aztecs, we know that the Aztecs were annihilated. I was in people's wrong books the other day when I said that America is a country of immigrants. And then they said, but how do you say? They said, no, it's a reality. The local people, the indigenous people, the Aztecs were wiped out. And then everybody who is there is a foreigner, so to speak. And I was saying that in the context of President Trump saying that America is for Americans. I said, who is an American? And then it became a big issue. Then, of course, I became notorious for that. But didn't worry me, I'm used to it. So in other words, Africanization is a specific context, and then the others, indigenization, and then, of course, decolonization have a different context altogether. Now, whether we bring in the forgotten and then replace the universal, then my answer is no, we bring the two together In other words, we are saying that this is what is now being used, be it the architecture, be it the language, be it the dress code and everything. But then let's also bring in the African flavor. Some of you might know this. There is a guy in KZN who is called Mngomezulu. Forget about what he's doing lately. But there was a time when he was wearing umqhele. And then I almost brought mine to make this point, but I decided otherwise. And then he was barred from using an airport because they said, you can't board a plane with this thing. I said, no, that can't happen. This is part of my culture. I am a Zulu. We wear this thing wherever we go. But he was told, no, cannot do it because they were applying certain rules. It became a big issue. I'm not going back there, but the point I'm making is, Ngizwe was saying that I am an African, but there is something that has been used universally, which is conventional practice. But then I'm not going to denounce my identity as a Zulu just because I want to comply. Rather, allow us to fuse these two together, then we'll be fine. And when I went to Australia, I brought my own umqhele, but then because I know Australia doesn't play games. At the immigration office, I'm telling you, they don't play games. Even if you come with a grape seed, you will be in trouble. I don't mean trouble, I mean big trouble. A seed, not a grape seed, you will be in trouble. So then I had to voluntarily declare my umqhele so that they could assess it and check that no animal was killed, it's not an animal skin, all those kinds of things. Because if they didn't allow it in and then you happen to sneak it in, then you'll be in trouble. So the point I'm making then is that when you bring in what is forgotten, to use Chinese words, you are not necessarily displacing everything that is there, but we're trying to infuse the two together so that there can be that coexistence. Mpumelelo, can decolonization of knowledge make sense in the industrializing world? The answer is yes, because you are not coming here to displace everything, but you are coming to infuse something else to assist in the process. Let's say, for example, we go back to the point I made earlier on about Africans being knowledgeable about geometry, trigonometry, and all of that. Because if you look at the pyramids, it's not Tom, Dick, and Harry who can do that thing. It's people who applied their minds, they got their measurements right. And these were not Europeans. And these were not Portuguese, as we've been made to believe. These were Africans. So which means, therefore, that African knowledges can be infused in the current setup where the world is industrializing without necessarily fighting the industrialized world. So you can bring in that. So in other words, it's doable. And then towards the end, do we restructure? Or I've already responded to that point about architecture, that we are not going to replace all buildings, current buildings with the old ones. So I'm going to skip that one. The last one about the risk of a polarization. Before we do anything, we must first know what is it that we're doing, and then decide how we're going to do it without necessarily upsetting the current system. So this risk of polarizing the nation will always be there. Say, for instance, we come to this university, then we say, this is an African university geographically located in the Eastern Cape, whose dominant language is isiXhosa. Then from 1 April, it will not be full state, it will be reality. From 1 April, the medium of instruction will be isiXhosa. That is what we want to do, right? But then the question will be, what will be the implications? What about people who don't understand isiXhosa and who don't converse in isiXhosa? Have we catered for them too? Going back to the Ubuntu concept, have we thought about how they will be affected? And then the answers you get from there will then determine how you go about achieving the goal you want to achieve without necessarily polarizing the nation once again. One thing that has happened in the higher education sector at a university like Stellenbosch, I was at the University of the Western Cape, and then we at the University of Stellenbosch, where the medium of instruction at some point was Afrikaans. Then at a later stage, they had parallel sessions where some lectures would be offered in Afrikaans, and then others would be offered in English. Then students from the 4 universities, Stellenbosch, University of Western Cape, University of Cape Town, and then CPUT, They came together, they went to march in Stellenbosch. They said, no, you must stop this thing of offering all your modules in Afrikaans. Also stop this parallel process where some lectures are offered in Xhosa and others are offered in English. Then the local community said, no, by the way, this university is supposed to serve its immediate constituency first. And the immediate constituency speaks Afrikaans. Therefore, the university is justified in doing what it is doing. Then the issue of language policy comes in and on. And then I'm not going to enter into what is happening now. But the point I'm making is you are trying to address a particular problem, and then you find yourself having 2 or 3 more problems to deal with. So before taking any action, first of all, identify the goal you want to achieve. And then look at different possibilities of achieving that goal. And then answer the question, what will be the best approach to achieve that goal without necessarily reinventing the wheel, as it were? Then the answer I will take you for. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I want to thank Bheki with a round of applause. Thank you very much for those insights. I think you gave us a lot to chew on, Prof. Mngomezulu. I also want to thank the students that have joined us both here today in our chambers as well as online. And I want to particularly thank Guilherme Borges, who's in Ottawa in Canada, who made the invitation happen and set up the meeting for us and so on. Thank you so much for your help, Guilherme, in making everything run very smoothly. And then also the research team at CANRAD, our interns and our postdoctoral research fellow, Dr. Knowledge Monzora, for your role in making today a success, and our co-PIs for joining. So our next event is an online seminar, and we will be hosting Dr. William Mpofu, who's at the University of the Witwatersrand. So please join us on the 7th of May for that. It will be purely online, so you'll be able to do it from wherever. And I'm looking forward to a similarly robust interaction. Thanks for being here today, and there should be some refreshments outside for you to grab. Thanks.
Thank you.